The Cadets is an absolutely wonderful organization for taking kids from dysfunctional homes and showing them something about a disciplined life and giving them some order and discipline and direction. I don't think it can be beaten. I think they're brilliant.
No, I agree. Would you agree, Mark?
Yeah, I love it. I think that's the biggest thing about the military is it creates that structure and it creates the discipline and that idea of purpose, motivation, and drive. I mean, how wonderful is that for society today? I think that's one of the things a lot of people don't talk about because they'd rather talk about the terrible things sometimes of the military. But when they talk to a veteran afterwards, they bring these stories of just camaraderie and teamwork and friendship out of it. So again, sir, I salute you for the continued work, for being the president of this association. Question on that, was there any music ever attached to your memories and early days in the service?
Not really. We had a pipe band, and of course we all marched to the beat of the bass drum, but I didn't really come to military music until the tattoo. And then, of course, I heard proper military bands and suddenly began to realize just how good military music could be and how much I enjoyed it and enjoyed it more and more and more, and continue to enjoy it to this day, and have been lucky enough to hear a hell of a lot of it on the many tattoos that I've had the privilege of doing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Washington Tattoo Podcast. I've got my great friend Stu Warmington on the other end. Stu, how's it going?
Good. Bit dismal out here at the moment, but that is the UK, so it's part and parcel of living in here.
Yeah, same here in DC. We had an incredible episode with Alasdair Hutton, OBE, and there were just things talking to Alasdair. Number one, he's just got this incredible voice and has this iconic voice of the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo. And I know, Stu, you have extraordinarily fond memories of this iconic, legendary voice.
Yeah, I've heard this voice from tattoos before I was in the Marines, and then obviously in the Marines all over the world. And now I actually get a chance to, I've got a chance to speak to him, and it was weird because as soon as he started talking, that voice was just what you hear. It's very strange, but it was a great interview. I found it really, I really enjoyed it. A lot of interesting bits came out, which I wasn't expecting, especially about his time in the Parachute Regiment. So that was interesting. And the fact that, even after he'd sort of left the Parachute Regiment, he was still working as an honorary colonel for the youth side of it. So that was great to find out about that side of it.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. The amount of things he's done is probably enough to fill 5 lifetimes. And from his military career to his philanthropy, unbelievable.
I know, and it's not just that. So his books that he does, his own books, and his children's books, and also audio books that he's done that he had no idea that he'd done, which was also an interesting fact.
Yeah, it's crazy. I gotta ask you, Stu. Is he kind of a childhood hero?
Yeah, now this is going to be a bit sad actually, because when I was young, I was brought from quite a military background. So I've said this before. I used to go to school with me Walkman on, and there wasn't any pop tunes. It was all military music and recordings from tattoos and royal tournaments. And his voice would be one of the ones I'd hear as a young child just walking to school. So to have this interview was great, and just to hear his voice as soon as he started talking, the first second. Man, it was amazing.
Awesome. Well, folks, you're really going to enjoy this episode with Alasdair Hutton, OBE, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Enjoy the episode.
Greetings, I'm Mark Riley, and welcome to the Washington Tattoo Podcast, where the world's musical traditions come to life. The Washington Tattoo is an international music and arts festival coming to the Washington, D.C. metro area. Our podcast explores the lives and stories of world-renowned musicians, dancers, producers, choreographers, artists, educators, arts advocates, and those who serve our cultural communities at large. For more information and donations, find us at www.thewashingtontattoo.com. Now, please enjoy this episode of the Washington Tattoo Podcast, sharing the power of the arts, one story at a time.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Tattoo Podcast. We have the wonderful honor of having Alasdair Hutton, OBE, the voice of the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo, on the line here. And Alasdair, I just want to say thank you so very, very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be asked. Honored to be.
I love it. I love it. A humble confidence is always very exciting for us. So I'm excited to dive into your story, to dive into just your experiences, and really to tell our listeners, a great wealth of knowledge about the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo, your story with the service, and your philanthropic giving back, because you are the consummate gentleman, very much being active with our forces and our veterans. So again, thank you for everything that you've done.
It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to, if anything I say can help, please, make use of it.
All right, sounds great. So on the other line as well, Stu, it's good to see you. How is the weather by you in the north of England?
Grim. It's always grim up north, and Sunday's no different. But hopefully this will be a little bit brighter, this podcast. But no, it's not the best weather. So
awesome. So we'll jump right in, and I think the last few days we've celebrated Robert Burns, the wonderful Scottish poet. So happy Burns Day and Burns Night to everyone. And just like we talked about earlier, we had a reunion of the three of us in 2010 from the Sydney, Australia. I think it was maybe the second or third time that the tattoo had been to Australia. But so Alasdair, on that note, you were mentioning earlier that the tattoo had traveled and that this giant castle that was constructed for the football pitch was also brought from an earlier tattoo. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, we were invited to take part in a sort of New Zealand arts festival in the year 2000, the Millennium Year. And that was being done at the Westpac Stadium in Wellington. And so to make it the Royal, well, not the Royal then, because it wasn't Royal then, but it was the Edinburgh Military Tattoo. They constructed a replica of the castle, and it was a very good replica. And I have a horrible feeling, my memory is not completely sure about this, but I think it was put in a store and then the store burnt down. So this wonderful replica, I think, burnt down with it. But the expertise that went into the building of it, I think, was then used to build the replica in 2010 in Sydney. And so I think the people who built it in Wellington came and helped with advice about how to build it in Sydney. And so it was not that wasn't the first time it was done, but it was a very effective thing. And of course, the difference, if anybody noticed a subtle difference, there were 3 entrances and exits to the castle in Wellington and Sydney, whereas in Edinburgh there are only 2.
Very interesting.
Well, it gave a bit more flexibility to the production. And of course, in both cases, there was a wide, flat, green area in front of the castle, which it doesn't have in Edinburgh. It's a sort of narrow tarmac, which was originally just the dumping ground for the building of the Merchants Exchange down the hill, that was leveled off to make a parade ground about the time of the Battle of Waterloo. And it's just been tarmacked over and used as a car park now, really, except when it's being used for the tattoo and pop concerts.
Well, I know when I was in the Sydney Tattoo in 2010, we were arguing about who was going to come out the main entrance. Was it going to be the Guards? Was it going to be the RAF or the Royal Marines? And unfortunately, the Guards wouldn't, because they wear red tunics and bearskins. So we had to come on from the side.
Well, absolutely. Well, I mean, the sort of, the kind of Johnny-come-latelys of the RAF and in the airborne we call the cabbage heads of the Royal Marines couldn't possibly take precedence over the household divisions.
Yeah, You know, we might be the senior service, but we always come second best to the guards.
So yes, no, it was. I mean, it was an interesting. I noticed in 2000 in Wellington, I could see this castle out the corner of my eye, but I was momentarily flummoxed by the fact that there was a broad green swathe in front of it, and I'm just thinking, that's not the right castle. It was there, and the show went well, except for the very last night in Wellington, where Wellington has terrible weather when it wants to have, and on the very last night of that tattoo in 2000, the wind and the rain came howling in, and it started. The rain started about 8:10. The show started at 8:30, and everybody got soaked to the skin. And at one point, as we were going through this final performance, Mel Jemison said, we're going to have to cut this. And so I sat there and waited for him to give me instructions. But of course, he was a donkey walloper. So for those who don't understand, donkey wallopers are cavalry. And but of course, so you don't expect the donkey wallopers to make decisions. So being airborne, I gripped the thing and worked out how to cut about 10 minutes off the end of the show to get the people off and get the public out of the rain, and it worked. But the awkward and difficult thing was, as always in every single show, there is no communication with the director of music out in the middle of the field. So it all had to be done by listening and tone of voice and what I was saying. Fortunately, Richard, I think it was Richard Waterer, who was the director of music in 2000. Richard understood exactly what I was saying, and certainly the pipers did. Because I asked Brian Brotherton, who was the pipe major of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, if he had understood it, and he said, "We did, sir, and we thanked you for it." So,
well, I know when the Royal Marines Band came back, their uniforms didn't go in a flight. They came back on board ship to save on cost. And I know when the guys opened their suit covers, they were just green. They were just covered in mold, and everything just got binned. I think they got a whole new issue with kit after that. It was horrendous.
But I'd heard that it was not good.
No. So obviously you're talking about airborne. This brings us nicely into your past and how you grew up. Did you have an influence of military in your life from a young age, and how did you get into the military later on in life?
I suppose there was an influence, but not in the way you're thinking of, because I happened to be born in London, where my parents, who were Scottish, were living at the time. But 3 months after that, we were bombed by the Luftwaffe. My mother was a very sensible woman, had put me in a Moses basket under the stairs, which was the strongest part of the house. So when the house fell down, the stairs were still there. So she grabbed what she could, basket and baby and all, and legged it onto an unlit, unheated train back to Scotland. So in a practical sense, I was influenced by the military, but not by our military, and not by peaceful military.
Wow, what a story!
But we went to live in southwest Scotland, and I have, to this day, I have a wonderful recollection of the American armored fighting vehicles that came ashore at Loch Ryan on their way to the south coast of England for D-Day. They passed through the village where we were living, and I had a pedal car, which was called Boanerges, and obviously it must have been squeaking, because one of the kind Americans greased it. This wasn't my mother's liking, because the grease came all over all fall over my legs and clothes, and she had to try and wash it off. So that was my next brush with the military. But in fact, when I really got sick, I always used to despise the cadets at school because of the funny way they sort of, you know, how people try to ape the senior NCOs, and they squeak and they. So I always used to think these were fools. But when I was about 24, I was out one night in Aberdeen and overheard a chap blowing hard about how he'd jumped out of a balloon and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, I don't know, if he could do it, anybody could do it. And then I thought, but of course, there's no good saying I could do it. I had to do it. And so I went along to the local TA depot of the Parachute Regiment, company of the Parachute Regiment in Aberdeen, and joined up and never looked back. So been an airborne, a member of the airborne ever since. And now I'm the president of the Scotland and Northern Ireland area of the Parachute Regimental Association, and very proud of it. So,
wow, that's incredible. So how long did you serve in total within the Parachute Regiment?
I was 22 years in the battalion, and then another 10 years in CVHQ, which was attached. I was attached to Wundiv, which was, of course, commanded by General Rupert Smith, who took Wundiv to Iraq, or took it to Kuwait, and beat the pants off the Iraqis. And then I did another 3 years as an honorary colonel of the cadets. So 35 years overall.
Wow, that's a long time. That's incredible. What a service.
But it's fun because I'm still in touch, but it all worked because I'm still in touch with the boys I served with in Glasgow.
That's amazing. I suppose it's, you know, you make these bonds for life, you know, it's not just while you're in it, it carries on, and it's the same with any service.
Absolutely.
But strange enough, my father was in 4 Para. He was a drum major in 4 Para down in the Gateshead area, and then before he transferred to the Fusiliers as a drum major. But you know, he enjoyed his time, and you know, he especially enjoyed his jumps, even though he was scared of heights. But you know, he loved it. But no, thank you for your service. I mean, it's incredible the amount of time you spend not only with the Parachute Regiment, but also the youth side of it as well, which I think is very important, especially in this day and age now.
The Cadets is an absolutely wonderful organization for taking kids from dysfunctional homes and showing them something about a disciplined life and giving them some order and discipline and direction. I don't think it can be beaten. I think they're brilliant.
No, I agree. Would you agree, Mark?
Yeah, I love it. I think that's the biggest thing about the military is it creates that structure and it creates the discipline and that idea of purpose, motivation, and drive. I mean, how wonderful is that for society today? I think that's one of the things a lot of people don't talk about because they'd rather talk about the terrible things sometimes of the military. But when they talk to a veteran afterwards, they bring these stories of just camaraderie and teamwork and friendship out of it. So again, sir, I salute you for the continued work, for being the president of this association. Question on that, was there any music ever attached to your memories and early days in the service?
Not really. We had a pipe band, and of course we all marched to the beat of the bass drum, but I didn't really come to military music until the tattoo. And then, of course, I heard proper military bands and suddenly began to realize just how good military music could be and how much I enjoyed it and enjoyed it more and more and more, and continue to enjoy it to this day, and have been lucky enough to hear a hell of a lot of it on the many tattoos that I've had the privilege of doing.
Incredible.
So you said you were brought up in London. Did you ever attend a Royal Tournament in London, or was the tattoo your very first introduction into military music?
Well, I was 3 months old when I left London because the house was in ruins, and but however, after I'd met Michael Parker, who invited me to join the Edinburgh Tattoo, I did go down and see the Royal Tournament once. They had a very fine narrator doing the Royal Tournament called Basil somebody or another, and I went to see that. But I think that was in the dying days of the tournament, when the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, was beginning to think they couldn't afford to devote this amount of military effort to just a big show. Foolishly, in my view, foolishly, but they pulled the plug on it in the end, which was a great shame, because Michael Parker was producing an absolutely magnificent spectacle, showing off the military, showing the best of the military, and the military just failed to realize exactly what they were getting from it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame. It was held in Earl's Court in London, which is a huge exhibition centre. Yeah. And it wasn't just the tournament itself, which is a military bands and acts from all over the world. It's the stuff that was outside. You could go and meet the forces, and there was other model shops, and there was all sorts going on. But Michael Parker's backdrops for the actual backdrop of the tournament were incredible. They'll change each year, and they would. I know the Marines one year it was the broadside of HMS Victory. Then when it was the Commando's turn, that dropped down, and it was a dry ski slope into an icy glacier. And it was, the thought that went into the tournament was amazing. It was such a good thing. And I agree, Alasdair. I think maybe it wasn't the right thing to do, and especially this day and age where you can't get people to join up. There's no focus for them to go and see or interact with people other than social media, which is not always the best option.
Yeah, well, Michael was very visual. His concept of whatever he was doing, whether it was the tournament or the tattoo or whatever else. And I went to visit him at his flat one day, and there were all the little mock-up sets that he had built, little models of these Royal Tournament sets. Wonderful creations, imaginative, brilliant creations. And I'm sorry that the MOD was so narrow in its vision that it just let all that slide, all gone, sadly.
I think that's very interesting, because on a couple different points, the Royal Tournament, I believe, started in the 1880s or something like that. It was, a very, very long time ago. And the idea and the principle of that has definitely left its mark in the United States, because the old guard used to have what was called Spirit of America, which was pretty much a model of the Royal Tournament and kind of the Edinburgh Tattoo at the time, mixed together with Pershing's Own, the U.S. Army Drill Team, and the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. And it was this kind of storytelling of what the Army could provide. And it was attached to recruiting. It was attached to in educating the local children about what the Army provides from a service point of view. But horribly enough, the Department of Defense priority is not really education. It's not the arts. And so there was just really no money left for the Spirit of America show as well. But I think that's also interesting with the idea of Edinburgh being a charity and seeing the nonprofit kind of side of it come into place, where it becomes that bridge between the Department of Defense or the Ministry of Defense and the local population, where it doesn't have maybe all the handcuffs and all of the tying of the hands that the military has to spend money in a very specific way. So I find it interesting, because there's also some parallels here, that the first thing cut almost everywhere in the United States is going to be the arts budget. And you can see it with the Department of Defense every single year.
Yeah, sadly, and the same sort of attitude in Britain, sadly.
So how that moved along to your connection with the Edinburgh Tattoo, now the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo, was Michael Parker the first kind of introduction to it? How did you first become involved?
Yes, well, it was Michael Parker that brought me in. He took over in 1992. Up until then, the producer had always been a senior military officer and had always done a bit of narration on the side. But Michael was a visual producer, and he was the best big event producer in the country. he took the tattoo. And Leslie Dow sadly was dying, and he retired from the tattoo. They took Michael on. Michael wasn't so interested in the sound part, wasn't interested in narrating it. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to direct it as well as produce it. And so he went looking around for a narrator. And he asked Tom Fleming, who did the narration for the BBC, and Tom was a wonderful actor, a thespian, but Tom was a thespian. He wanted to wear tights. He didn't want to sit narrating this show, and he wanted to be free to do his more artistic work at the festival. So he turned it down. And Michael turned then to the BBC outside broadcast producer, Ian Christie, and asked him if he knew anybody. And Ian Christie racked his brain and was standing next to my brother, who was the senior designer at the BBC, one day in a place where the ladies can't go. And he asked him Ian Christie asked my brother what I was doing. And he said, not a lot. So Ian suggested to Michael that because I had been a BBC announcer and a part-time soldier, I might do the trick. And so Michael got me in to see him in his office in the castle, which was in the castle then. And I think by that stage, he'd reached the bottom of the barrel, really. And so I was all that was left. So he just took me on, and happily it stayed.
Wow.
That is absolutely incredible. I think for all of us, we were very lucky that the bottom of the barrel was a very high standard.
So, Alasdair, in 2011, Brigadier Alfred came in and he changed your title from the narrator to the storyteller, which I think is exactly what you are. So I'm just interested to know what your duties were when the start of the tattoo for the next year started. You know, how soon in that process did you get involved?
Well, usually what I would try to do is probably just in the autumn of the year, I would find out what was in the producer's mind for a theme for the show, and then find out what acts were coming along, in what order, and then try to devise a thread that bound them all together. Because I'm never sure that the producer thought of it in quite those terms, but so what I regarded my task as being was, David described it as providing a banister rail for the audience, but for me it was more like a golden thread, you know, that started at the beginning and wove its way through the different acts. And what I always tried to do was to figure out some link that told the story from the first to the last, and tried to find some way of suggesting that, in fact, this was all a carefully thought out arrangement, when in fact I didn't think it was anything of the sort. I mean, for example, just to give you an idea, on one occasion, very early on in the piece, we had a band from Egypt, which was an extraordinary band, really. And the producer, who was then Mel Gibson, said to me, I bet you, I think he inherited then, I think, a vignette from Michael about the history of the Stuart monarchy. So Mel said, I bet you can't find a link between the Egyptians and the Stuarts. But of course, I did. In that some of the Stuarts claimed very ancient lineage right back to the daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh called Skota. This was the obvious thread to draw from the Egyptian band to the history of the Stuart monarchy. And there was also some gibberish about Skota bringing the stone of Scone, the ancient sort of crowning stone of the Scottish kings, out of Egypt, that it had been Jacob's pillow as described in the Bible, and traipsing through Europe with this thing and finally finishing up in Scotland with it, which I'm sure is all complete rubbish, but it makes a great legend.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think when we go back with our connections and our stories together, it actually was Sir Mel who really was nudging me as a member of Top Secret. So this is many, many years ago. It's been a while since I've lit drumsticks on fire and threw them to other people. So I'm a little out of practice. But I think so the most interesting is that Sir Mel and now recently Brigadier Alfrey have been very good in their mentorship of helping us with the Washington Tattoo kind of really get our feet underneath us and learn the ropes of, here are some lessons learned. I would go for this. I would try to stay away from that. And that's been extraordinarily helpful. And I know that you've been friends and colleagues with them for many, many years. And I think what I really pulled from, talking about the showmanship from Sir Mel, really to the kind of storytelling and the weaving of concepts, overarching concepts that Brigadier Alfrey brought to the table, Scottish traditions and telling the story of Scottish traditions and how it links to the world is really, I think, your bread and butter. So could you speak a little bit about how important you feel telling the story of the Scots is, and why is that important?
I think it's important that people understand exactly how we got to where we are today. And so telling the story of Scotland over and over again in different ways, I think is terribly important, particularly to new generations. It rather worries me if we're going to have all that forgotten. I mean, when I go to America to, the sort of Highland Games type things at Stone Mountain or Grandfather Mountain or any of that sort of thing, I see what the Americans think is Scotland. Elaborate kilted outfits with shirts done up with a bootlace at the neck, all that kind of thing. It isn't quite how we live in Scotland today, but it's how the people of Scottish ancestry think we live. And that's what they come to Scotland for. So you've got to somehow give them that, plus in a modern setting. And we've done that successfully in the tattoo up to now. And I hope that the new team will go on doing that successfully. But only time will tell. But there are an awful lot of, there's a feeling in Scotland now that you've got to create an image of Scotland which isn't Scotland. It's a sort of made up image, and it's not quite right. If you come from America or Australia or New Zealand or Canada or South Africa or any of these places, you come to Scotland to see bagpipes, to hear bagpipes, to see tartan, and to see bonny lassies dancing. And I don't want to see all that thrown away to present some kind of cod Scotland that doesn't exist.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I feel that's one of the things that has to be done so very delicately. And this is something, being a traditional drummer many, many years ago, and thinking about the idea of maintaining that tradition that was passed down from generation to generation to generation, and having the respect of saying, okay, if I create this box, which I think is honestly what the military really did for me, and being in the Army, is it showed me the box, and I would try to be creative inside of that box. But I would always find the very nook and cranny of each of the corners of the box to recognize when my toe went over the line and then something didn't work. But then I kept it kind of just on that line of maintaining tradition, maintaining the heritage piece, but also being able to hybrid modern ideas, but hybriding the modern idea from the roots of heritage and tradition.
Hmm.
And it has been a very successful model to think of it kind of in that way from a musical point of view. But now going into really kind of the nonprofit and almost business world, that's another key component of realizing what brings people into your product or your story.
Yeah.
We just want to take 1 second here at the Washington Tattoo Podcast to thank our sponsor for this episode, McClellan Bagpipes. Roddy McClellan, artisan and master maker of distinctive limited production and bespoke bagpipes. McClellan instruments are crafted from the finest materials using traditional skills originating in Scotland. Attention to detail and dedication to the highest standards of quality guarantee a bagpipe which is more than just a musical instrument, but also a work of art. Born in Scotland, made in the USA, McClellan Bagpipes.
We want to share a great opportunity with you to get your business name out to our listeners. We are looking for individual episode and yearly sponsors for the Washington Tattoo Podcast. So if you love music, history, and want to support military veterans, please take this step with us and consider being a sponsor. For information on that, please email marketing@thewashingtontattoo.com.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you have got to do. That's what anybody's got to do, is understand what the audience wants, what the audience will come and pay for. And that's what the tattoo has successfully achieved up to now. We've sold out every seat for the last 20 years. So it must have been successful in creating a show that people want to come from halfway around the world to sit in the rain and watch.
Agreed.
Yeah, and it's, for me, it was something I watched on the TV as a young child, and then eventually got lucky enough where my parents could take me to go and watch it. So I mean, this rolls on nicely. Most people don't know you got a lot of books published, and one of them is the Tattoo Fox, which it's won awards. I think it's great. So how important do you think it is for children to get involved in the tattoo scene from a young age? Because the Tattoo Fox is a great way of getting them to understand what a tattoo is, and just getting that brand awareness, if nothing else.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm glad that had that much success. If we don't create a new generation of tattoo lovers, the tattoo will die. So getting children sort of tuned to the tattoo rhythm is terribly important, I think. I mean, the Tattoo Fox arose because David Alfrey was sitting contemplating his first tattoo in the stands one night after rehearsals and just trying to think, what about this, what about that? And he heard this scratching on the stand and looked along, and there was a fox sitting there looking at him. And he looked at the fox looked at him. Then the fox, expecting David to speak to it, and he was silent. The fox got fed up and left. He said that he ought to get somebody to write a story about this. And I said, foolishly, without thinking, it's the sort of thing you do off the spur of the moment. I said, oh, I could write that. And then, of course, came the crunch. I spent 3 months desperately trying to get that book started, and I couldn't. And I was just on the point of lifting the phone and saying to David, sorry, David, I'm going to have to let you down. I can't do this. And then I suddenly thought, the motto of the Parachute Regiment is your trinque paratus, ready for anything. Write the blasted thing. Get on with it. And I did. And in about 4 days, I had it written.
Wow, that's incredible. The success of it is spurred, follow-ons from that as well. Am I correct?
I did write I've written 2 more. One more was published. The editor wasn't particularly pleased with the third one. She thought it was too much like other books that had been published. So that never got off the ground, but I could still read those stories to children if they wanted. And then I've written other ones. I've just this last year published a book called The Castle Cat, which is the cat that was in the Tattoo Fox. how did the castle cat get to the castle in the first place? And so that's happily, that's selling very well. I found a really good illustrator. So people are buying it for the pictures, not for the story. And it's going well. But that's also it tells the story of how these friendly soldiers allowed this little cat, starving, hungry cat, to come with them to Edinburgh Castle and, you know, look after the mice in the castle. And then the cat, you know, does little things. I've written 2 or 3 of these, so whether the others will ever be published, I don't know. But they all have the basic underlying intention of trying to be well written, but also encourage children to see soldiers, the military, the tattoo, anything else in a friendly light. Because broadly speaking, I mean, there are a few bad apples, but broadly speaking, you and I all know that the military are good at heart. And we're not, you know, we're not sort of savages. We're not sort of ravening wolves, hungry to go out and tear people from limb. We like to have them. And, well, you probably don't remember, but the IRA pushed out a dreadful sort of cartoon of people wearing red berets, wolves wearing red berets, because this came right after Bloody Sunday. I mean, their propaganda was vicious. And of course, that's the sort of propaganda which is pushed out to a wider public. It does not tell the true story. And so these little books are there to subliminally tell a more true story about what soldiers are really like.
Yeah,
I love it.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned that, you know, people are buying your books so, you know, they can look at the illustrations. Now, I bought your other book, The Greatest Show on Earth, for you know, one to hear your story, but also because of the illustrations. But then I do a lot of traveling to work, so I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and I found yours. But what's different to your audiobook is you narrate yours yourself. Now, obviously, being the storyteller of the tattoo, that made that more interesting for me than the actual book, because it's like you're talking to me. So that audiobook I found was incredible. Bear in mind, I've listened to your voice since I was so young, and then to have you talking to me, for want of a better respect, in the car on the way to work, it was incredible. So, you know, I'd recommend for anybody who wants to read the book, get the audio version, because, you know, for the man who's telling the story to read it back to you is incredible. It really is.
Well, I'm interested to hear that, because I didn't realize it was in audio. I must have read it at some point for somebody, but nobody's come up and said, here's a copy, here's some payment, nothing. So, I mean,
all right, Audible. We're gonna have to talk to the Audible about this.
Yeah, well, now you've told me that, Stu. I'll go and chase the guy up and see what I'm doing with my work.
Well, it's definitely you, because you've got such a distinctive voice, so it can't be anybody else.
Well, no, it won't be anybody else, but I'm sure I have recorded it. I'm pretty sure I recorded it, but I thought I was recording it for a blind book, you know, for a blind magazine, but there we are.
Could be some royalties, then.
Yeah, well, I do a lot of that. I try and read stuff for blind people, and so I think I probably thought that's all I was doing it for. Anyway.
I love it. So it's interesting that you bring up this image of the military, because I remember being in 2016 at the Norwegian Military Tattoo in Oslo, and a handful of us from the old guard were getting some burgers at the place, and we all kind of looked the same, and it was a big group of us. And a young gentleman came and spoke with us and said, you know, wait, hey, you guys are American. What are you all from? What are you here? What are you doing? And we said, well, we're here for the Norwegian Military Tattoo. And he kind of was taken back for a minute. He goes, okay. I mean, so what do you do? And he said, well, we're all musicians. His immediate response was, I didn't know that the U.S. Army had musicians. I thought the U.S. Army really just killed people. And it was one of those like moments where average person and the general public in a major city has that impression. And one of the beautiful things that I've talked to Sir Mel about and Brigadier Alfrey about time and time again is this concept of soft power, and being able that if military musicians were able to do their job accurately and with confidence and executing it properly, the return on investment for the Department of Defense and the Ministry of Defense is soft power being used properly so that we don't have to go to war. And one of those things I think with the tattoo environment is that it showcases that talent, it showcases that story, and it allows for those international collaborations to happen between military leaders. And so when you are working with all of the various tattoos over the world, you've worked with, I think, civilian-led tattoos, you worked with military-led tattoos. Could you speak a little bit just on the amount of different tattoos you've worked with over the years?
Yes, well, I think, Sue, you were on the first Berwick tattoo, weren't you?
I was, yeah. So I was before I joined the Royal Marines, I was in the 6th Battalion, the Royal Regiment Fusiliers, and we did the Berwick tattoo in '94, and I think 2 years later in '96, which I'm pretty sure you were there. I remember your voice, and that was my sort of, not the first introduction to you, because obviously I'd heard when I'd been to the Edinburgh tattoo, but physically being in a band and hearing your voice when I was on the stage. But yeah, the Berwick tattoo, which was, it proved really popular, you know, and the Berwick tattoo, as you know, but for Mark who doesn't know, it's set in an actual barrack, so it's a perfect backdrop, you know, and it's in a sort of, you know, a town that is on the coast, and it's a perfect, you know, for a small tattoo, it's a perfect venue to kickstart something off like that.
Yeah, well, see, that was organized by the military, but inspired by civilians who wanted to stretch the tourist season in Berwick a bit longer than it was. So that was, in a practical sense, almost a civilian tattoo. I did one at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, which was, I think, not a great success, but it was that was a civilian tattoo done in a military setting. I've worked with Colin Harper, who had been the senior director of music of the Australian Army, who then came out of the army, and he organized a series of tattoos in Brisbane, as well as concerts of different kinds. Sadly, he's dead now. But most of they were a great success, although I have to say, one of the startling things about that was the second one had one of those electrifying challenges that you don't expect but enjoy the experience. One of the stands started to collapse, and so we had to empty the stand without the audience realizing that they were at risk, and we did it.
Wow!
It was, it was a wonderful challenge. Colin had said, "No, under no circumstances were we going to stop the show and do this." The stage manager, to be fair to her, said, "I'm in charge now. We are stopping." And fortunately, the Australians like an interval in the middle, I suppose, so they can have another beer. So we got away with it that way. But I mean, what I can recall distinctly from that as well, or maybe it was on another occasion, the central band of the Russian army, which was staggeringly good, were out selling their kit because they were so poor. They were selling the bits of their uniform so that they could afford little luxuries. I don't know have you ever heard of Lieutenant General Afanasiev? He was, imagine a band conducted by a lieutenant general. I can't, it's staggering. But he conducted the central band of the Russian army, and it was quite brilliant. Almost as good, not quite, but almost as good as Pershing's Own, conducted by Colonel Gary Lamb. Do you remember Gary Lamb?
I absolutely do. I actually ran into Gary Lamb's son in Estes Park, Colorado, about 4 months ago. So it was completely random out of the blue. But yeah.
But I think there in those sorts of things, and now this is getting away from other tattoos, but those were civilian tattoos. The Australian ones were civilian tattoos, but with a very strong military overtone. But the two things that I remember distinctly about those were that the Russian band played the 1812 overture. Gary Lamb's band played the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and they were staggering performances. And I think there must be something about the way that the military plays tunes from their countries that allows them to draw something special extra out of that music that other people can't quite do, because those two bits stick out to me.
No, I love that you bring that up, because it's always funny. The old guard is known for playing Yankee Doodle at the White House. That is one of our pride and joys, is playing Yankee Doodle. And the musicians, of course, some of them really understand the power of what the symbolism is, and others could care less, to put it lightly. But it's interesting because we have these protocols that we always end our sequence at the White House with Yankee Doodle. But the only time that it has ever changed is when Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth came to visit. And we thought that would be quite rude of us to play Yankee Doodle for the sovereign. So we decided to play British Grenadiers. But what that did was it changed how people thought of their country's musical heritage. And the tunes that you play are a representation of the story and the history of your nation.
Yeah, well, that stuck out to me from those two performances in Brisbane. The Russians playing the 1812, the Americans playing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Memorable, absolutely memorable.
That's amazing. So, Alasdair, at the start we mentioned just very briefly Robert Burns. I just wonder if you can, not only just educate me, but obviously some of the listeners, why is he still so important today? Because I believe you're part of the Robert Burns Foundation. So what does that involve?
Well, I was involved in as a founder member of the Robert Burns World Federation Guild of Speakers, not the World Federation, but the Guild of Speakers. That is to try to bring up the standard of speaking at Burns events, Burns suppers principally, because an awful lot of people get away with an awful lot of rubbish and low quality speaking at these events. And of course, if people are bored by people speaking twaddle, then they're not going to have any respect for Robert Burns. But of course, the one thing that I must emphasize to you is that Robert Burns was a volunteer soldier,
Wow.
Very, very few people seem to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
When Napoleon was charging across Europe, conquering country after country and threatening to invade Britain, there was a whole series of these local volunteer groups set up, and Robert Burns joined the one in Dumfries. And when he died, he was in still serving. They were still threatened by Napoleon, and he was buried in his volunteer's uniform. So, even Robert Burns was a volunteer soldier, but very, very, very few people in the kind of eulogizing world of Robert Burns recognize this. I think the reason why people still eulogize Robert Burns is because he was an exceptionally fine poet. He had a grasp of the rhythm and flow of language. He could get the right word to convey the right emotion, and still to this day, his respectable stuff, is revered across the world. He had a number of rather bawdy things as well, but we don't usually use those in polite company. But but I mean, he was an exceptionally good writer, and he also was an exceptionally good collector of kind of rural speech and rural songs. He in those days, a great deal of stuff was passed down by word of mouth. And he was an exciseman. He did some farming, not very well, not very successfully. So he took a job as an exciseman and traveled about the country on horseback, collecting as he went, listening to and collecting songs and poems from the people he talked to, the country people that he talked to. But he had, like Sir Walter Scott, he had an exceptional memory, would ride along, carry these things in his head. If they weren't complete, he would complete them with his own poetic skill, or transmogrify them completely into something completely different, turning like a bawdy song into a love song, that kind of thing. He was very skilled at the use of language, and so it's right and proper that he should be revered.
No, I agree. And I lived for a bit of time up in Rosyth when I was in the Scotland band of the Royal Marines. And my son came back from school one day, and he could only have been about 6 or 7, and they were doing Robert Burns stuff. And he went, I've got a poem I've got to read. And I pulled it out, and I could not read it. We had to get one of our friends, one of the other buglers, his wife was Scottish, and she basically tutored him how to read this poem. I was like, I can't read it. It was weird.
He wrote some of his poetry in Scots, in Lowland Scots, and some of it in straightforward English. So it rather depends on which poem you pick. But yeah, Lowland Scots is quite difficult for people who have no concept of the language. You see, because I grew up in a village in southwest Scotland, that was the language we spoke at school. That was the language we spoke amongst the children in the village, and the language we spoke at school. So of course, for me, it's fun because I can understand it without any difficulty. But I can imagine that somebody from the south of the border just can't conceive of what these words mean, even though they're not that difficult, really. But some of them, you see, they're very difficult. It's because, you see, nowadays in English, a dike means something else, but in Scots, a dike is a wall.
Yeah.
A burn, for example, in normal standard English means something, that injures you. But in Scots, a burn is a stream, and things like that. So, the word kirk is pretty well widely understood, but of course that's a Scots word derived from the continent, from Dutch and German, and it's an interesting language, but as you say, very difficult to understand unless you've been brought up with it.
Yeah.
Oh, incredible. So with all of the learning of Robert Burns and talking about speaking eloquently and doing it properly, I have to ask a little bit of this as well, because you were a member of the European Parliament at one point as well, and was that helpful? And did that kind of like challenge you to learn, speaking well and engaging, and so what was some of your experience with the European Parliament?
Well, the European Parliament was absolutely fascinating. A tiny amount of history. When I was 14, my father died, and my mother decided we would go to Australia for a new opportunity for the children, because I had a brother and sister as well. So off we went. In Australia, there were a lot of immigrants from every part of Europe. There were kids in my class at school from the Baltic states, from Western Europe, from Eastern Europe, and so on and so forth. So already you began to understand what had driven them out, what had forced them to go there. And basically it was communism had driven most of their parents away. And so when I came back, I never really thought about going into Parliament, but it just happened. I was talking one night to a chap who thought that the European Parliament would be a would be very interesting. So I just decided to put my name forward. Luckily, I was selected and then elected, and it meant that I could begin to do something practical about trying to make Europe a coherent bastion, really, of freedom, democracy, and so on and so on. So I'm bitterly sorry that Britain's chosen to turn its back on it. It's part of that worldwide movement towards nationalism, which we saw manifested in America recently, which you could see manifested in Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, and in other parts of the world. It's not a healthy thing, because we saw it a century ago in Europe, and it led to a dreadful war. Well, there were two dreadful wars, really. So I was really happy to be part of an international institution that was trying to do something to unite people instead of divide them. And of course, there we had extraordinary people. You had the chap who, if his father hadn't abdicated, who would have been the King of Hungary, Otto von Habsburg. We had a von Moltke. We had Graf von Stauffenberg's son was there. These were people with, the Duke of Wellington's son was in our, not son, yes. Well, the Duke of Wellington's heir was one of our members. There were people who brought European history to life, as it were. They were the living embodiments of it. And so for me, as a perfectly ordinary person, being amongst them was absolutely fascinating. Yes, you learn to speak up, to speak out, and to try to be clear so that you could be understood. Because of course, everything you said had to be interpreted into other languages for the people who didn't speak English. Although most of them did. Most of them could speak English better than some of the English speakers. But it was an absolutely fascinating experience, and I was sorry that eventually I had to leave the Parliament. I lost my seat, but probably it was a good thing. 10 years is long enough to do anything. So, that was fascinating, and that all grew out of the experience in Australia.
Wow. And I think it's interesting that you put that in real quick, because I know when you have people coming from other countries seeking refuge, or they're looking for a better way of life, the people or the country bringing them in, it would do a lot of good to really do a deep dive on that individual experience, so that they're getting the firsthand account of what caused them to leave, versus the telephone game of this person saying this, and really the reason getting kind of lost in the sauce when it comes to, I heard something on social media, I heard something on the television, because that intimate one-on-one experience with someone who left their home country to become part of something new is honestly a powerful tool for so many of us who have families generations down the road who have all left a certain place to make a better life somewhere else. So we have that commonality. And I always think it's amazing to hear people's stories of why they decided to help another person in need. And then if they have the power or the influence to help that person, what vehicle do they choose to do it, whether politics or music or the military? There's so many ways to give back. And I think it's amazing that throughout your career, you have done it in almost every way imaginable to help give back, to make the world a better place. And so it's just been incredible to hear your story.
I mean, what I love is the fact that even, you were talking about being in the European Parliament, about, not dividing people and bring people together. And, and that's exactly what you do at the Tattoo. Soon as you start narrating that story, you're bringing people as one for that time when they're there, and then they can go away and they'll always, remember that. Now, what I found interesting in when I was listening to your book was the fact that you sort of have, you've got a script that you sort of run across with for the duration of the Tattoo, but you also have like a secondary script as well, if I'm correct, where you have in case of incidents or where you need to pad out sections where, and that just goes to show that you go, you take your time away from that to go and speak to these people, learn new bits, and just in case you need to pad that out. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I have had about 40 minutes worth of history and other things to fill if necessary. And of course, what you can never tell is what's going to happen. I mean, for example, there was one show when somebody had a heart attack in the East Stand just before the show. Well, we couldn't start the show while there were medics trying to get some seriously ill person out of the stand. So that needed to be filled. And at other times, you need to have filling. Going around the audience before the show also brings you little tales of who's there, where they're from, and I'm hoping that intimate part of the show won't be lost, because it does. You're quite right. People like to feel that they are part of one big happy group of people. And, if they're all cheering, if they're all from, all the people cheering from Belgium or from Norway or from Switzerland or Korea or wherever, they're from all over the world, but there they are, all bonded together in one place. And I did like to try and do that for them, to make them all feel as though this was, they mattered.
Yeah, I know as a performer, just waiting for the tattoo to start each night. That was one of my favorite bits. You go around all the different countries, and obviously being in the military, we've got people ourselves from different countries. So even though you can't hear them, there's people in the band cheering when you say their countries, and it's great because obviously you go around the world and you get closer to home until you get to England and Scotland, and obviously it's a bit of a who's going to have the loudest cheer, but no,
they like to have a little bit of fun with the English versus the Scottish. But I remember one night with when the Gurkhas were on, I deliberately threw in a little mention, anybody here from Nepal? And there was always a little cheer from behind the courtyard.
No, I think it's really important. I think that really sets the scene for the audience to enjoy the show. If it's like any TV show, you have a warm-up act before the show starts, and if you don't have that, they're sort of, they're not in the mood straight away. So I think that's a really important aspect of the tattoo that shouldn't really be lost. You need to warm the crowd up before the tattoo starts.
Some people miss it. I had a message from a woman who said, why don't you ever mention South America? And the answer is because nobody ever cheered when I asked about something. So I did it once or twice and still nobody ever cheered. But
I love it.
You're right. People notice. People do notice, and they do seem to care.
I think I like what you brought up about the people coming from all over the world, and really in that one moment during that one time, they're all a community. They're all a family together for that time frame. Yeah. And I think that's where we've been doing a lot of philosophical digging of what our tattoo, what the Washington tattoo can provide. And when we talk about the idea of identity and having an identity in music or in the military or in a social group or something like that, each of us individually have an identity. Can we see it? Can we articulate it? Can we recognize our own identity? And then the idea of taking that identity as one and feeling like you're belonging to something else. So inside of that, in the show, you're belonging with this group of people experiencing this world-class entertainment, this beautiful backdrop, and being a part of history being told in that moment. And then when everyone leaves, they're a part of this community now that they look at it every year. They can come back. They can stay engaged on social media. They can be part of a newsletter. They can read history from the thing that they learned about maybe on the surface, but then they can go home and dive deep into their own family story or their community story. And I think the idea of identity, belonging, and community really is something that you've helped embody for your entire career. And I love the fact that there's so much strength in really the not just the heritage and the tradition, but the philosophy of what makes this all work.
Yeah, well, David, if you ask David Orfrey, he will tell you that when he first heard me doing it, he thought, this is naff, this is family favorites, this is awful. But after a little while, he realized the effect and came around to it. And I think he would encourage you to do that. So, yes,
yeah,
I think that's an important part of the show.
I love it. Do you want to do a little bit of wrapping up here? We always end each podcast with 4 questions. So we kind of call it the final 4. So obviously you've experienced so many musical memories over the years, but do you have some favorites?
Yeah, well, as I say, those 2 extraordinary performances in Brisbane from the Russian Central Band of the Russian Army of the 1812 Overture and Gary Lamb's Pershing's own performance of the Battle Hymn of the Republic are memorable. But I think my favorite tune of all is the 48th farewell to Gibraltar, Pipe Major McDonald's farewell. I may have made a mistake there, but anyway, the 59th. I'm so sorry. Farewell to Gibraltar. I mean, the regiment. I think it was the Cameron Highlanders. They were leaving for Canada, and they sailed out of Gibraltar with this marvelous tune, which is still absolutely brilliant. And then they were promptly becalmed for 2 weeks. So they I got pretty sick of hearing it. But that would be my favorite. I also wish that the Tattoo had brought back the Turkish Meta Band, because I heard them in '92 and thought their music was fascinating, absolutely remarkable. But they never came back. For some reason, I don't think Mel liked them very much. And so he never asked them back. But they were another musical favorite that I really, really enjoy. And the memory of them stays with me to this day.
I remember watching them on the TV. I do remember that. But you're right, they've not been back since, but I remember that.
And they have this very peculiar way of marching. It took a step and then a step sideways and then another step and then another step sideways. And it was completely alien to us, but completely fascinating. They were I think they were representing the old Turkish Yeniçeris. So they're fascinating, absolutely extraordinary. And I wish we'd seen more of them.
Great. Stu, you got the next one?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, obviously you've written many books and what have you. Do you have a favorite book yourself that you like to read over and again, or it's one that you've really enjoyed, whether it's musical or non-musical?
I think probably the book that sticks in my mind of all of the books that I've read over the years is a book called John McNab, written by John Buchan. John Buchan was a Scottish writer. He's best known for the 39 Steps, but he wrote, quite early on, he wrote this this marvelous story called John McNab about 3 very, very senior men who were just all bored with life and who challenged 3 landowners in the Highlands to what was basically a competition to see if they could poach a salmon or a stag off their land and get it away. But the character within this book, which of course appealed to me as a small boy, was the child called Fish Benji, who was sort of roped into their shenanigans. And Fish Benji used to appear with this cart full of fish for them. And that appealed to me wonderfully as a boy. The other one is also a John Buchan book called Hunting Tower, where a gang of ruffianly boy scouts from the Gorbals part of Glasgow were heroes of the hour. Those 2 books, I think, would probably be my favorites. They're jolly good, rollicking stories. They're not substantial books at all, but I like those, and they've lasted with me all the years.
I'll have to check one of them out. Sounds amazing.
John McNab, I've got a copy of John McNab signed by John Buchan as John McNabb.
Wow.
Great.
That's
Incredible.
That's a great treasure.
I love it. Alasdair, do you have any hobbies?
Narrating shows. I I'd like to, I suppose what passes for a hobby really would be helping various charities and the church and things like that. And that fills my time. Plus, and a lot of the time it's just taken up trying to write scripts and stuff like that. So I suppose that's my hobby.
Wow.
Perfect.
So just to finish off, Alasdair, if people want to know a bit more about you, how can they find out about you? Do you have websites? Do you have, any social medias or?
Not really.
No.
I've got a biography on Wikipedia, but that's probably about all that I could offer, really. But
I mean, I suppose we can push people towards the books that you write, because obviously The Great Show on Earth gives a good account of your life and your involvement within the tattoos, not just the Edinburgh tattoo, but like we've mentioned before, the Berwick tattoo and the tattoos all around the world. And so it's probably, if anybody's interested, that's a great book. And like I said before, the audio version is great.
I must follow up this audio version, as I haven't got a copy of it, so I must find out who did it and where the royalties are.
I love it. Well, I just want to say, Alasdair, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. It's been hilarious. It's been brilliant. It's been educational beyond belief. And I do recommend, if anyone is interested in learning more about your story, is to look for those books. And honestly, if you listen to any recording of the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo from, was it 1994? Is the first year?
1992 was my first one.
1992 to the present day, you will hear this wonderful gentleman's voice, and you will be completely entertained, and you will not regret it. So, Alasdair, thank you so much for your time today.
Not at all. Thank you very much for your invitation. As I say, it's very, very kind of you indeed. I hope that didn't waste your time.
No.
Thank you, Alasdair.
Thank you so much.
Greetings again, everyone. We just wanted to take a second to say thank you to Seif Studios for their creative media. If you want to find out more about Seif Studios, look them up on www.seifstudios.com. We'd also like to say thank you to our educational partner, ProLogix Percussion, American-made drum pads. They're doing a special discount code for our listeners today. So if you go to www.prologixpercussion.com and type in TWT20, you will receive 20% off your entire order. So thank you very much for tuning in today, and please check out our supporters.